Hello, everyone. Guess what? I am here to tell you, you don't know Jack. That's right. We're actually going to take a look at a guy named Jack Tramiel. Jack Tramiel was really, really big in the late 70s and early 80s. And we'll come back to a little of the story, but this is the guy. Doesn't he look friendly? Doesn't that just look like a friendly guy? No, he does not look like a friendly guy, does he? He doesn't. But let me tell you, he is one of the most fascinating figures in computer history that we have and is not often talked about. But then again, you're learning now that so many of the people that did so much back then aren't really talked about. We tend to move forward, and as I said, in not looking back, we actually miss the opportunity to learn a lot about what's going to happen. And his story actually tells us a lot about what is going to happen. Now, this is Jack Tramiel, and Jack Tramiel was a Holocaust survivor. If you are not sure what that is, you can pause this video and look up Holocaust survivor, and you'll probably see some images that are very disturbing. Right, World War II, the Nazis want to kill every Jewish person in the world that they can get their hands on, not just every Jewish person in the world, but anybody that's different. So if you're kind of gimpy because one leg's shorter than the other, we need to kill you. Right, that was the whole attitude. And so his whole family is in a concentration camp. He lived in a concentration camp as a kid. And so when he was freed by American and British soldiers, he was like, you know what, I'm going to go and repay this country that gave me so much, that gave me my freedom, that made it so I survived, right? His family did not, but he survived. So he goes over and joins the army in America. And he probably was a little disappointed, or maybe he was just happy to be able to serve. I don't know. He hasn't really ever remarked on that. But he said that basically he was a typewriter repairman. And so we look at that and think, it's interesting. But back then, right, that would have been huge. He would have been busy all the time because the typewriter is the computer of the then. And everybody's got to have one. Everybody's got to type stuff, all those forms and everything. And so he spends a lot of time doing that. Well, when he gets out of the service, he's like, hey, I'm going to seize the American opportunity here, right? I'm going to go and build something. I'm going to make something. So he decides to start making typewriters. Makes sense. That's where his skills are. Well, as things move along, he catches on to this technology that we really don't talk too much about. Calculators. We don't talk too much about calculators, and a lot of people consider these the predecessor to the computer. And again, I don't really start there. You definitely could follow through that era. I usually start with basically arcade systems because they're doing something much more than just 4 plus 4 is, right? So I can actually type in Commodore here. See what they make. So he starts to make calculators, and he founds a company called Commodore. That's what he founds. These actually, like, look at that. In-box vintage 1973, like new, basically. Somebody wants $500 for that. There's quite a following for these calculators. So he's making calculators. And I mentioned part of the story that basically Texas Instruments is the calculator people. And of course, if he wants to make calculators, he's got to put TI chips in his calculators, Texas Instruments chips. And then Texas Instruments realizes this guy is going to undercut us, right? So instead of competing on what you can do, they decide, well, we're the ones making the processors he's buying, like the chips, the ICs he's buying, so we'll just raise the price to him. So we make them down here, and that's what we get them for, but we'll make him buy them way up here. Well, this is going to just totally run him out of business. And he's really got a problem now because he's going to be run out of business because he can't afford to make these. So instead of giving up, what he decides to do, as stated in the other video, is he goes out and buys this MOS technology. For some reason, I clicked out of it. MOS technologies. You can see that 6502 pops up immediately that we talked about. We'll be talking about. I'm not sure which video is going to come first. So he goes out and buys this MOS Technologies because they make chips. That's what they do. And so now he can have a direct feed. I own the company, just like Texas Instruments doing, right? Texas Instruments making their own calculators. They're making their own chips. I'll buy Moss Technologies and make that stuff too. And of course, really the big thing that comes out of this, right, that saves the company. He's making calculators still, but during the process of dealing with people and restructuring, which is usually stuff that needs to happen. But, you know, he was known as being very decisive, we'll just call it that. So again, he would call people into his office and he'd say, so what do you do here? And if they couldn't explain what they did, or he didn't think that that was important, he'd say, well, you're fired, and get your stuff and clear out. And so he wasn't very kind when it came to that stuff. And then that's when this other person that we are mentioning here came in, and that's Chuck Peddle. Chuck Peddle comes in. This is him. This is him back then. He almost looks younger as he's older. I don't know how that works. But Chuck Peddle comes in and he basically says, hey, we got this processor, this 6502 processor. And Chuck, to go over to his story, Chuck had worked at a company called Motorola. Now, you probably don't know Motorola, and if you do know Motorola, then what you know about Motorola is only that they make phones, or that they actually have, well, phones is what people know them for, these phones that Motorola would make. Well, back in the day, Motorola made some really awesome chips, and one of them was a 68,000. And it was a 32-bit chip, right? So everybody's making 8-bit chips. They didn't even go to the 16 level. They just went to the 32 level. And Chuck Peddle helped design this chip, which is fundamental also in the industry. These are all the chips that the Apples used, and tons of other machines, RISC machines using them. In any case, he didn't like the fact that they were really selling these for a lot of money. He really felt like the industry is not going to use it if you're selling it for too high of a price. And then that's when he leaves and goes and works at Moss before Jack shows up and takes over. So he's designed this, him and his team has designed this 6502, that's the 6507. So he's designed this awesome chip and basically says, hey, computers are the next big thing. And we really need to make something known as a personal electronic transactor. That's what he called it. And that's where this is. This is a PET, personal electronic transactor. And this is actually what it looked like first. It had this weird, stupid keyboard. I think some of the makers back then thought, we're not quite sure what to do with a keyboard, so this is what we'll use. And it's like, well, you've had keyboards on mainframes for quite a while, and all these dumb terminals. I think you could have just realized that that was the way to do it. So this keyboard was not liked. And they made a decision. This was part of Jack's decision. Jack always had this this opinion that you're making computers for the masses, not the classes. And that is a quote from him. He's the guy that said, you should make a computer for the masses, not the classes. And he would therefore make it as cheap as possible. So you can see that this computer, this PET computer, which was done in January 1977, had the MOS 6502, 1 megahertz, and it was basically $800. And it came with a built-in screen. So there was a new technology out, and that was called a floppy drive or a floppy disk. But that would have raised the price significantly. The accepted technology at the time was a tape drive. Tape drives were slow. If you wanted to save something, you had to say, okay, I'm going to save it, boom, and then it would say hit play, record on tape, and you hit record. Tapes were using analog technology. In order to store information, it was a lot cheaper to do. Well, when you look, right, this comes out again in 1977, so you're right here. And the Apple II comes out just before, right? So wait, June 1977, did I get that backwards? And January, yeah. So the PET came out and then the Apple came out. That's the way it went. But they did not have this tape option, right? They had a floppy disk option. Right here, this would have been a rich person's system. It's got 2, holy crap. The system did not come with 2. When it says right here, you could buy a 1298 version with 4K of RAM, which is nearly unusable. or you could buy a 48K system, which is 2600. They are not including the monitor or a floppy drive, but you're going to end up having to buy that anyway. See, this is 1978 that comes out. So that's an important thing that happens, because there's a company called VisiCalc. So let me pick which one. So we're kind of done. We're kind of done with Chuck, visionary man. But Chuck made the 6502. Oh, one thing I need to mention about it, because it's going to be on the quiz. They actually, at the time that they made it, they actually couldn't afford to have a booth at CES, or the big computer show. They couldn't afford that. And can you imagine going to a computer show back then when they did this? Because that would have been hot. I mean, there would have been stuff you've never seen before in your life. It would be like going to, you know, when they show off all the games, but you're seeing games like you never thought of before. That's what this was like. It was like, holy cow, let's go see who made a computer and what you can do with that thing. Well, they couldn't afford a booth. And so they were selling these 6502s out of their room upstairs. And as a matter of fact, I forgot that basically that's why the Apple comes out later, because the Apple uses that 6502 and they picked it up out there. You know, like you could buy them. How much do they say? Like 160 bucks a piece or something. So people were just buying these chips like crazy because they were going to go build a system off of it. And that's something that Commodore always did. They always sold that chip and didn't stifle competition by saying, oh, that's going to cost you more. We're going to put it in our machines for cheaper. They sold it to anybody. And if you haven't seen that video, you'll see it was put in there tons of stuff. Just a genius. And again, I always point that out, because if you type in 6502, this is what you get. Wikipedia page comes up. There's a whole website just talking about it. There's tons of people that still will try to program for that chip, and no, they weren't born when I was born. I built a 6502 computer because the chip was just like, wow, how did this guy come up with this, right? In any case, enough of the 6502, but basically Apple came in later with theirs. They had a floppy disk, and that was really important because there was the killer app coming. And this is an important concept. If you were in my 103 class, you've been introduced to this. If you weren't, or maybe didn't watch that video, then you won't know. VisiCalc. Every single piece of hardware that you have to sell or need to sell or want to sell has to have a killer app for it. So, excellent example, Xbox comes out. What's the killer app for Xbox? If you don't know, it was Halo. That was the killer app. The reason to buy the Xbox was because you ran Halo on it. You can do that with game systems all day long. You know, when a new game system comes out, they need this premier game that's only on their system, and that becomes the killer app. The reason to buy or spend the money on the hardware is so you can run the software. Well, back in the day, right, all this is coming with programming languages, so you can use Microsoft's programming language to build your own stuff. But I don't want to do that. I want to use something that's better than what I would make, and I'm willing to pay for that if I can. Well, VisiCalc was the first spreadsheet computer program for a personal computer. Originally released for the Apple II in 1979. Right, so why did VisiCalc do this for the Apple II and not for Commodore? Well, Commodore didn't have that floppy drive, and they wanted their software to be shown off the way they meant it to be in its ease of use. And so they designed it to work with that floppy drive, and it became Apple II's killer app. In other words, Apple probably wouldn't even have been as big as it was if Jack Kilby didn't have that mantra of computers for the masses, not the classes. So we're going to make it as cheap as we can. Because if he put a floppy disk in there, or been faster at getting the floppy drive into place, like, oh yeah, it comes with a tape, but you can buy a floppy too, it would have been built for Commodore. And that's according to the maker's own words, because there were a lot more Commodore PETs out there. Businesses were using them, and Education was using them. They were all over the place. They were all using them. And so VisiCalc was the reason to buy a computer. And since that was on Apple II, I'm going to buy one of those. And you just go in and I'm trying to decide on what computer to buy. Let me see. Right. And then you look, oh, wow, I can do this on an Apple. What is this called? It's a program called VisiCalc. Okay, give me an Apple with that. Right. And tons of businesses were dealing with spreadsheets, right? This was like the first massive use. In 103, that's what I tell my students. You've got to have a killer app. There's a reason for you to buy that phone. And it is something that you want to use with it. And that's the killer app to you. And game systems, they have killer apps. Well, here, VisiCalc was killer app. Now, something that I'm going to throw in here, so I'll have you test it on this, because it has to do with the 70s, but it doesn't have to do with Commodore and Apple. The guys that made VisiCalc did not copyright or patent anything. And so that was dumb. They had the idea that if they didn't patent it, then it would spread and it would become popular. In my opinion, they just had a hippie way of looking at it. And they do say it was the dumbest thing they ever did, because what happened is this company in 1983, Lotus, they made something called Lotus 123, and they made a much better version of VisiCalc. Well, how did they do that? Well, they just took VisiCalc and made it better. Right? So you literally are just taking somebody else's programming that they did not protect and then just making a better product. And VisiCalc becomes a thing of the past that nobody uses within a couple of years, and everybody uses Lotus 123. So they have this real hippie view of just like, oh, we'll just share it out there. And then they realize, oops, probably shouldn't have done that, because they didn't make any money off of it, to tell you the truth. Well, not much. Anyway, so that's an interesting story that happens of some people that did not read the Times and what they had. Kind of interesting, because they knew that it was extraordinary, that VisiCalc was really selling like crazy, and they didn't realize that can't somebody else just copy all of our work and then make it themselves? And they thought, oh, no big deal. It was a big deal. All right, so back to sorry, my controls are in the way once again. Always get in the way. Back to Jack, and I think I'm going to have to look him up. Jack Trammell. So Jack basically is enjoying the success. Commodore is making millions of dollars. He's making billions of dollars. And we're going to get further into this in the 80s stuff. But his mantra of make a computer for the masses, not the classes, continues to push Commodore into the stratosphere. And now there's tons of stuff you can watch on the internet, but I remember before the internet got big, it was all stuff about Apple, IBM. And you never heard about Commodore. And for the majority of us that lived during that time, Commodores are what we used, because they were cheaper machines and they were very capable machines. And we'll look at the fact of why do you not see them anymore, and what mistakes happened in the 80s. Because Jack really had, sure, he was mean, but that mantra of being able to say, how can we make a profit and get it to as many people as possible? Can you imagine a business person today thinking of that? Apple certainly doesn't think of that. That was his thing. That was for him. How do I empower people, right? If I'm doing this as cheap as I can and still making money so that we can survive and be successful and continue to the next product, then I'm doing something great for other people. I'm giving them the opportunity to better themselves. And so you can really see that this really hard youth he had of growing up in a concentration camp and then going into the military, which had to be difficult, and then going out on his own and trying to build a company, have another company try to smash you in the face and get rid of you, and then still survive and then become a billionaire based off of this mantra. All that stuff really affected who he was. And for him, that's probably as friendly of a face you're going to get. What all this one is. I watched this one, and he talked about all that time and what he did. And he talked just very frankly about the fact that, hey, what we were trying to do is just get these computers to people, let them use them, let them better themselves in their society through having these kinds of computers. We were not there to make sure that we all became billionaires, but if we were doing our job right and we were creating something that people loved and wanted, then that's exactly what would happen. And so we'll hear about his tragic end in another video, but fantastic visionary, somebody who came from typewriters. That's the other thing to look at here. He comes from typewriters. Guy comes in and says computers are the next thing. And him not being a computer guy, just making calculators, goes, you know what? I hear what you're saying, and you're right. Let's do this thing. And he throws millions of dollars behind this computer, this pet computer, and it becomes massive and puts them on the top. And then it's like, okay, well, what can we do that's going to be better? What can we do that's going to be better, and making it better? So that is it for Jack and the others that I've talked about. So hope you had good notes, and thanks for watching.